Hello and welcome back. In this lecture video, we're going to be doing some more problems associated with cost allocation. Okay, so if you're following along on the course pack, I'm on page 253. And so what we're talking about right over here is that overhead cost allocation methods. Organizational units in manufacturing firms, we can classify them as a production department or a service department. So a service department would be like a support function. So think purchasing or think accounting. The production department is actively involved in making the final product. So think maybe an assembling department or a finishing department. Another example of a service department, which you could also substitute the word support function, would be like human resources, or maybe the company cafeteria, or the janitorial department. Those are all support functions. They're not actively involved in making the final product. This is important because in the type of cost allocation that we're talking about in this chapter is we're talking about something called the direct method. So with the direct method of cost allocation, what we're saying is that service departments such as janitorial, accounting, purchasing, the company cafeteria allocate their costs directly to production departments. I'll say that again. Service departments allocate their costs to production departments. So what doesn't happen though is that one service department would not allocate its costs to another service department. So for example, even though human resources personnel may eat at the company cafeteria would not allocate its costs to human resources. Even though the janitorial department may clean the offices of human resources personnel, the janitorial department would not allocate its costs. That would be service to service. But what we're talking about is something called the direct method. And with the direct method, we're only talking about service departments allocating their costs to production departments. So if we look down here and we look at this little diagram, this kind of shows a little bit visually what I was just talking about. So we have our service department. Service department costs are allocated to production departments. Remember, service departments are support functions, but not other service departments. So for example, we have a janitorial department would allocate its $10,000 worth of costs, perhaps based upon square footage, right, to the assembly department. The service department janitorial would allocate its costs also to the finishing department. Human resources personnel would allocate its costs to assembly and to finishing. What we don't see with the direct method is that. This would be one service department allocating its costs to another service department. Okay? That would not be the direct method. The direct method is service to production. Service to production, not service to service. Okay? There are other methods called the step method and the reciprocal method, which do account for this relationship between service departments. That would be addressed in a higher level cost accounting class. In this course, which is more of an introduction to managerial accounting, we're just reviewing the direct method, which says service to production, not service to service, not service to service, okay? So if we continue on and we look at the next page right over here, we have an example of the direct method. Let me just pile these up. So what we say right over here is the building maintenance department for our Taylor Bath Manufacturing Company budgets annual costs of $3 million, okay? And so the costs are allocated to two production departments. So if we think about the maintenance department, that would be a shared function. Maintenance services a lot of other production departments, maybe the finishing department, maybe they help out machines that are being broken in the assembly department. So the maintenance department would be a shared function. And what's happening is they're going to allocate their costs out to two production departments for Taylor Bath. Now, Taylor Bath is thinking about two different types of allocation bases. One would be square footage, one would be direct labor. Okay? So, if we look over here, we have our 30,000 over here, 20,000 over here. Okay? So we have Department 2, all right? Let me move this up here. Department 2, okay? Now it's set up right. So we have our Production Department 1, they have 20,000 square feet. Production Department 2 has 30,000 square feet. Production Department 1 has 30,000 direct labor hours. Production Department 2 has 20,000 direct labor hours. So what we want to do here is determine how much cost will be allocated of this 3 million, right up here, this 3 million, which is the service department costs. How much of that cost will be allocated to Department 1 and to Department 2 based on square footage and then based on direct labor hours. And then we'll make a comment upon and we'll discuss which allocation base, square footage, or labor hours is better. Which one's preferable? So when we think about how to do this, the first thing that we always do is calculate the rate. Okay? How do we calculate the rate? We take our total cost to be allocated divided by our total allocation base. So in this case, I'll right over here, I'll say square footage. Okay? And I'll do my first step, which is to say my $3 million divided by my 50,000, which is my total square footage. So remember, the way we calculate the rate is total cost to be allocated divided by total square footage. Okay? And what that gives us is 60. Now, in terms of square footage, this 60 represents $60 of cost per square footage, per square foot. That's how much will be allocated. So if we think about what this 60 means, that helps us then determine how to allocate out that $3 million based on square footage to Department 1 and to Department 2. So now we can do is say Department 1, and we follow what we've done before. We calculated the rate, and then we say the rate times the amount of allocation base used is how much is going to be allocated. So we come over here and we'll say our 60 times our 20,000 gives us our 1.2 million. Okay? And then we can say Department 2, 60 times our 30,000 gives us our 1.8 million. Now when we do this for direct labor, I'll draw a line over here and I'll say direct labor, the rate is the same. It's 3 million divided by 50,000. It's still 60, but it's $60 per labor hour, not per square footage, because we're not talking about square footage. It's $60 per labor hour. So then what we say is Department 1, we say 60 times the 30,000, 1.8 million. Okay, and then we can say Department 2, it's reversed, 60 times the 20,000, 1.2 million. Okay, so it's going to be reversed that way. Now, when we say which one is preferable, now remember when we talk about what's the preferred allocation base or the characteristics of an allocation base that we talked about in an earlier lecture video, what we're saying is that the allocation base has to be something that's common to all cost objectives. So when you think about what the cost objective is, it's either Department 1 or Department 2. The allocation base is square footage or labor hours. Now, if Department 1 doesn't have any square footage, if everybody's just working from home, then it doesn't make sense to allocate any cost to Department 1 based upon square footage. In that case, you might want to use labor hours because it's not a characteristic that's common to both departments. So that would be the first thing that we'd want to think about. The second thing is, what's the true causal factor? So if it takes more labor hours for Department 1, then maybe what we want to do is allocate based upon labor hours. If maintenance costs vary with square footage, right? But if there's more square footage, that means we have to hire more maintenance personnel. Then what we want to do is allocate it based upon square footage, because the square footage of these cost objects is what's driving the costs of the maintenance department. If that's true, that would be square footage. On the other hand, if it's labor hours in these two departments, which would imply more employees, okay, or employees working more, if that's what's driving the maintenance department costs, then we should use direct labor hours. In this case, we're not given enough information to really make that decision. But when we think about which one is preferable, those would be the factors that we'd want to consider. The other thing to think about is that cost allocation like this serves as a real backdrop for political motivations. And this is what can be very interesting, is that let's say you're a cost accountant and you're sitting in a meeting with the manager of Department 1 and the manager of Department 2. What cost allocation base do you think Department 1 is going to argue for? They're going to say square footage. Why? Because they get less cost. Which allocation base do you think Department 2 is going to argue for? Direct labor hours. Why? They get less cost. Their arguments, right? They may not say, I want direct labor hours because I get less cost. They probably won't say that. What they'll probably say is, I think it's labor hours. Department 2 will say, I think it's labor hours because labor hours are what drives the cost of the maintenance department. Department 1 will say, no. Square footage. What are they really trying to do? Minimize their cost. But their arguments will be cloaked in rationality. But their real motivations are political, simply reduce costs. That's one thing I want to point out to you, is that these cost allocations can be real battlegrounds for political motivations, and that's something that can be really interesting to understand. And it's also something that you need to make sure you understand, okay? So let's look at the next problem, which is our Dow company, okay? And in this problem, what I want you to do is I'm going to pause the lecture video, and I want you to do this problem on pages 255 and 256 of your course pack. And then I want you to come back and then we'll check it together. Okay, thanks. Okay, hello and welcome back. And so let's review this problem to see how well you did. So our company allocates the cost of the company cafeteria to production departments. The company cafeteria, as we talked about before, would be a service department, a shared function. Based upon the direct method, which means service to production, and it based upon the number of employees in each department. The 4 production employees in the company have the following number of employees: molding 25, polishing 35, engraving 30, and packaging 10. The costs are $120,750 of the company cafeteria, and there are 5 employees. When the company's costs are allocated, what's the amount per employee? Well, it's going to be $120,750 divided by 100, which gives us our 1,207.5. You may have said divided by 105. Now, what you would have done in that situation is included those 5 in this denominator, because if we add the 25, the 35, the 30, and then the 10, we get to the 100. But the problem with saying 105, it's 2 problems. First, this represents their cost, and so you're allocating it out to other departments, okay? So you don't want to include them in the denominator. And then second, this would reduce this cost, right, per employee, and so they would not be able to allocate out their total cost to these different production departments. So when we look down at the next problem, what's the amount of net cost that will be allocated to the molding? We take our rate times the amount of employees in our molding department. The next one, same thing. The rate times the amount of employees gives us our cost. The rate times the amount of employees gives us our cost. And then finally, what's the total amount of the cost? The $127.50. Thank you.